in designing a message is a concept called audience analysis. And audience analysis is just a fancy way of saying that you want to kind of size up your audience and who they are so that you'll be able to speak in a meaningful way to them. So if we were going to look at a formal definition of an audience analysis, we have, first of all, learning your audience's needs concerning a particular topic. So what is it that they actually need to hear in reference to your topic? And then also learning about your audience's interest. What would your audience be interested in knowing? What do you think they would want to know about this topic? And then last of all, some pragmatic considerations that have to do with the speech setting or the location and all the circumstances surrounding where your presentation is. So if we were to take a look at those first two items, your audience's needs and interests, basically what we're trying to get at is the idea of effective communication. So think about effective communication like this. When you speak to someone that you know extremely well, sometimes we can say very few words, but they still know exactly what we're trying to say. In other words, it almost seems like they can read our minds. That's what we call extremely effective communication, when we have very few words, but lots of meaning. This is what we have with people that we know really well. That's why our communication with people that we know really well seems to be effective. So, ideally, our communication with any given audience could be just that effective. But, unfortunately, we don't know our audience as well as we know people that we're close to. So what we have to do is resort to what's called an audience analysis, trying to figure out as much as we can about our audience so that we can have effective communication with them. So what types of things do we want to know about our audience if we're trying to learn about them? One thing we would love to know about our audience is audience demographics. Now, these are what we consider to be summary characteristics about our audience. These would be things like age, gender, cultural background, socioeconomic status, religious and political affiliations, and other things of that sort. So any characteristic that you could summarize about your audience, anytime you would attempt to place your audience in a category or in a group, that would be what we call audience demographics. Now, audience demographics are oftentimes things that are observable, but the reason that we really want to know audience demographics is so that we can try to figure out more about what motivates our audience's thinking. So audience psychology is really what we would love to know about our audience. What makes our audience tick? What's important to them? What types of things what types of things make your audience happy? What types of things would make them sad? What types of things do they worry about? This is what we call audience psychology. According to your book, audience psychology has to do with three things. First of all, attitudes, which are your audience's natural feelings. Some people like cats, some people like dogs. Some people like flying, some people don't like flying. So these would be our attitudes. And then we have things like our beliefs. Our beliefs are things that we consider to be real or not real, things that are true or false. So our beliefs would have to do with things like whether or not we believe there is a God, or whether or not we believe there is an absolute truth. Those types of things have to do with our belief systems. And then last of all, our audience psychology has to do with values. Our values have to do with our most enduring judgments, those things that don't change very often. And in fact, those things that have taken, in many cases, several years to develop. So the belief that education is extremely important, those types of things would have to do with our values, our most enduring judgments. So those are the types of things that we would love to know about our audience. We would love to know audience psychology, and oftentimes we'll use audience demographics to make good assumptions about audience psychology. So that's the idea of learning about our audience. So the next question is, how do we learn these things? How do we collect information about our audience? One way to collect information is by observation. One of the really valuable tools that you get out of a speech class is you get to hear all the speeches that have happened before. So at this point, you have heard basic pieces of information about your audience from previous speeches that they've done. And also at this point, you've also paid lots of attention to your audience. Just being in class a little bit early before class starts, hanging around class a little bit later, seeing each other on the yard, all those types of things give you lots of chances to observe different characteristics about your audience. So that's one way that you can collect information about your audience, is by observation. A second way to collect information is by interviews. Interviews you can do two different ways. You can have open-ended questions, which has to do with questions that give your audience the ability to choose a response on their own. So you ask them what they think about something, or you ask them their opinion about a current event. Those are open-ended questions. Then you also have closed-ended questions. Those are questions where you ask your audience yes or no, or agree or disagree. So you give them a closed-ended response, or a set response that they can choose from. And then another way to collect information about your audience is with surveys or questionnaires. And with some speeches, you may decide to have a survey that you pass out to the class, and you have them answer questions beforehand so that you can kind of see where they stand on certain issues and use that in your speech. So one type of survey is called fixed questions. That's where you give your audience a set yes or no response, or agree or disagree. And then you can also do what's called scaled questions, where you ask your audience to what extent they agree or disagree with something. So, for example, on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most important, what do you think about whatever? So that would be an example of surveys or questionnaires. And then another place where you can collect information about your audience is with written sources. If any of you are ever asked to do a speech outside of class, this is a great place to go for information. Try to find mission statements that were written by the organization that's asking you to speak, or maybe you can try to find goals, the institution's goals that they have. Or you may look at operations manuals, or anything that's in writing that can be an extremely wealthy source for information. So oftentimes you can find these things on websites, or you can find them in documents that the organization produces. And then the last place where you can find information is from other speakers. It's always a good idea to ask other speakers what they thought about a particular audience. So if you know of other speakers who have given presentations to that particular group, ask them what their impressions were. And oftentimes they can give you a lot of insight. The last consideration about an audience analysis has to do with just the logistics of the entire occasion. So think about the location. Are you going to be inside or outside, for example? Are you going to be in a big building, or a big auditorium, or a small classroom? Think about the time of your presentation. Early morning speeches may have different challenges than afternoon or evening speeches. Also, if you're doing a speech on the weekend, that may have a different feel. Think about the seating capacity. So are you going to be in front of an audience with 25 or 30 people, or 500 to 1,000 people? And then depending on that seating capacity, what type of arrangements will there be? So will you have equipment? Will you be able to use a computer, or will you have access to lighting, for example? Or will you have access to a sound system? All of those types of things can make a big difference in terms of how you plan and prepare for your presentation. So overall, the idea of an audience analysis is to try to get to know as much as you possibly can about your audience and about the overall occasion, so that you can make some really good decisions about how to make sure that your message is meaningful to your audience.